The Honourable Jim Anderson.
Mr Speaker, Mr Key told the House today that a society should be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable citizens. By any measurement, the young, seriously disabled children in conductive education programs across New Zealand must be counted as amongst the most vulnerable of New Zealand. And in spite of promises to the contrary by Mr Key himself, the funding for those conductive education programs has been cut 30% this year and will be entirely ended by the year 2014. Mr Speaker, if you wanted a measurement of the most vulnerable kids in New Zealand, they would be them, and the National Party government has completely ended their funding, in spite of pleas from all over the country as how successful and important those programs are. Mr Speaker, the headline in the Christchurch Press from the weekend on the front page says, "Does this look like the road to recovery?" Well, Mr Speaker, the obvious answer is it does not. And in my electorate office area of Selwyn Village, every single business on the opposite side of the road has left their premises. Nothing has changed or been done since September the 4th. And the only answer we get from our urgent inquiries is that the council is talking to the owner, who I understand lives in Taiwan. And those talks have been going on for 5 months, and not one single action has been taken except to cordon off the whole area, and every single business is gone. And all the business on the other side of the street, except mine, which happens to be funded by Parliamentary Services, is at risk as we speak. Mr Speaker, if you fast forward that headline, "Does this look like the road to recovery?" to New Zealand's economic recovery, how do John Key's words about an aspirational government and heroic television appearances pledging progress and prosperity match up with the same kind of rhetoric we saw night after night on television at the time of the earthquake in Christchurch? Again, the obvious answer is about the same. Lots of hype, no action. Here are the problems that the Prime Minister should have talked about this afternoon. After more than 2 years in government, economic growth has stopped. Any so-called recovery has stalled. Unemployment is going up, not down. And I have to say the co-leader of the Maori Party has got a very short memory as to the reduction in unemployment for Maori around New Zealand in the 9 years of the Labor-led government. It went from 28% to 4%. And I would have thought that's something to be celebrated, not to actually be castigated. Jobs are being lost, Mr Speaker, not created. The cost of living is increasing, but incomes aren't keeping pace, particularly for low middle income New Zealanders. What is the Prime Minister's strategy to tackle these problems? He doesn't have one. He has had all summer, even in Hawaii, and he comes down to this House with a plan to just muddle through. A shopping list that won't create jobs, won't lift incomes and won't help. His economic policy consists of asset sales. That is not an economic policy, Mr Speaker, it's a surrender of the sovereignty of New Zealand. Not one new job will be created by selling off the people's ownership of power companies. But every one of us will be paying higher prices for power to the new overseas owners. We know this because we've seen it all before. John Key wasn't in New Zealand for most of the 80s and 90s. He was helping speculate against the New Zealand dollar on the international market. But I was here, and I heard all of the arguments for asset sales last time round. The arguments for asset sales were fatally flawed then, and they're just as fatally flawed now. I walked out on the then government caucus because asset sales were a bad idea, and the idea hasn't got any better. And that's why we had to buy the assets back. We had to buy back the rail system because National privatised it for less than the price of the wooden sleepers. And this rail system was an integral part of the transport system, and it had been wrecked by overseas owners who disinvested and saw it ruined. We had to buy back Air New Zealand because it was privatised into the capable hands of private owners who sent it bankrupt. And we were in danger of not getting our planes back from wherever they were because they were leased and we couldn't pay the rentals on them. That's how bad privatisation got for our most strategic industry. And Mr Speaker, we had to start a new bank because the foreign owners of our entire banking industry sucked New Zealand's banking industry dry. They closed 1,300 branches. They increased fees and their own profits, and these were shipped overseas at the rate of $1,300 million a year. How do you get a better level of indebtedness, an improved indebtedness, and a level of ownership of your own country if you're exporting all your money to overseas owners? If anyone can square that circle, I'd like to know what the answer is. I haven't seen one single rational explanation of that. Mr. Speaker, why would selling our power companies be any different? Why would the new foreign owners suddenly discover the virtue of charity over shareholder profit? Why would the assets not fall into foreign ownership, just like the last lot that we were going to be kept for Kiwi mums and dads? If I ever hear that again, I think I'll scream into the television set. Kiwi mums and dads, get a life. The first thing that happens is the overseas owners turn up with a little bit of better offer for the Kiwi mums and dads, and they sell them, and then they're owned by overseas companies quick smart. And if anyone thinks that 49% of a company ownership doesn't give you some right to a say in how the company's run, they must be dreaming. Mr. Speaker, the same tired old lines from the past are being trotted out, and the same promises that will be made this time will fail exactly the same as they did last time. I'm here to bear witness that the same mistakes are being proposed as were made last time a government paid for tax cuts by selling off public assets. I was told, and we all were, that if we sold $19 billion worth of assets, debt would be ended. There'd be a new nirvana. New Zealand ended up owing more money after we sold the assets than we did before we sold them. How does that work? And now we talk about the indebtedness of New Zealand, talk about the indebtedness of the whole of New Zealand, not just the public debt. And if anyone is to be thanked for the public debt being in a position where we can borrow money in a recession, it is Michael Cullen as the Minister of Finance of this government, not Bill English or the National Party. Mr. Speaker, the only thing that's restrained the rapaciousness of the power companies in the last 10 years is the hold that government has on the board appointments. And the fact that the government is going to give that away, potentially, and have no control over power prices should be a scary fact for all New Zealanders. When the power companies are sold and the boards are free to do what they like, even worse, what they have to do by law, which is actually to see to the minority interests of shareholders before any other interest. So if that doesn't ring some alarm bells in somebody's head, I don't know what would. And those companies will have to protect those shareholders' interests in terms of earning as much money as they possibly can from monopoly interests, which actually, ironically, is served if you make less power available because you can charge more for it. How bright do you have to be to figure that one out? I don't know. It doesn't seem to have occurred to anyone on the other side of the House. Mr. Speaker, I said at last year's budget that there'd be a few things that would happen in New Zealand. Let's look at what I said and what's happened. I said the average New Zealander would not be better off because if people are not on high incomes, this government is not going to help them. That's exactly what has happened. People on average or below incomes, which is the majority of New Zealanders, are worse off now than they were a year ago. I said that unemployment would be higher, and it is. Unemployment is higher today than it was when National took office. It's higher than it was last December, and we were going to stop all New Zealanders going to Australia, and more people are going to Australia than ever before. And we can't even get people in Christchurch to fix the buildings because they're going to earn more in Australia. Where's John Key now? You know, come back, John, all is forgiven, if you can actually prove that you can fix that one. And the government has stopped even pretending it has any ideas where the new jobs will come from. What happened to John Key's bike trail? That was going to fix everything, 4,000 jobs. And nothing the Prime Minister said today will increase exports. Nothing he said today will boost investment in research and development and help productivity. Last year I said the gap between rich and poor would increase. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out if the Prime Minister gets $1,000 a week in tax cuts and the poor person in New Zealand gets nothing from tax cuts, the income and wealth gap between rich and poor actually increases in New Zealand. And surely it's bad enough. And the Leader of the Opposition has already mentioned what happened in Magee and Close, where John Key went in 2008 to pretend he was compassionate about child poverty. The poor kid is now in SIF's care, and John was going to fix all that too. Mr. Speaker, what was announced today that would make her better off? The answer is nothing. Here's what a respected professor of epidemiology in New Zealand said last year. Quote, in New Zealand, social injustice is killing and maiming our children on a grand scale, end quote. We top the scales for OECD rates for whooping cough, rheumatic fever, pneumonia and other diseases in children. 28% of our children still live in poverty. What have they got to hope for? They have more unemployment, more GST, more price rises, higher rents and a government that doesn't care a fig about what happens to 90% of New Zealanders as long as the 10% of the top are looked